In the summer of 1944, the world stood at a crossroads. The Second World War had raged for nearly 5 years. Entire nations had been occupied, cities leveled, and millions of lives extinguished. Yet even in the midst of such darkness, the hope of liberation lingered, quietly, persistently, like the faintest candle in a vast night. By June of that year, all eyes turned toward a stretch of coastline in northern France. Normandy, with its winding rivers, hedgerows, and small fishing villages, would soon become the stage for one of history's most ambitious undertakings. But before that storm broke, life in Europe carried on in a tense, uneasy rhythm, as if the continent itself were holding its breath. To understand D-Day, one must first step back into this world of waiting, of anticipation, of dread, and of fragile hope. The invasion of Normandy was not only a clash of armies, but a convergence of countless human stories. The lives of French villagers living under German occupation, of German soldiers guarding a seemingly impenetrable wall of defenses, of Allied leaders planning an operation that would change the direction of history, and of young men preparing to cross a dangerous sea into the unknown. Occupied France, life under the swastika. France had been under German control since 1940. After the collapse of the French army and the signing of the armistice, German forces occupied northern and western France, leaving the southern zone to the collaborationist Vichy regime. By 1944, all of France was under direct German occupation. For the people of Normandy, daily life meant living with scarcity, fear, and uncertainty. The occupation was marked by rationing, curfews, and the constant presence of German patrols. Farmers were forced to give up portions of their harvest to feed the occupying forces. Families learned to stretch what little food they had: potatoes, bread, watery soup, while coffee and sugar became luxuries remembered more than enjoyed. For children growing up in those years, war was the normal state of the world. Schooling was interrupted, many fathers were gone, prisoners of war in Germany or members of the resistance hiding in the countryside. There was also silence. Conversations in public were hushed, eyes wary, words measured. A careless remark could bring arrest. German soldiers billeted in farmhouses or town halls were both a burden and a reminder that France was not free. Posters in German, proclamations from the occupiers, and the ever-present swastika banners fluttering in the wind transformed familiar villages into alien spaces. Yet resistance endured. Farmers and villagers passed messages, hid downed Allied airmen, or sabotaged German transport. In the hedgerows and forests of Normandy, resistance fighters trained in secret, waiting for the moment when their actions could join with a greater Allied force. For them, every rumor mattered. And in the months before June 1944, the rumors grew louder. The Allies were coming, though no one knew when or where. The Atlantic Wall, Fortress Europe. On the other side of the equation stood Germany's defenses. Adolf Hitler had long feared an Allied landing in Western Europe. To guard against it, the Germans constructed what they called the Atlantic Wall. It stretched from Norway's frozen coasts down the shores of the Netherlands, Belgium, and France, all the way to the Bay of Biscay. The Atlantic Wall was no single wall of stone, but a vast system of fortifications, bunkers, machine gun nests, artillery batteries, minefields, barbed wire, and beach obstacles designed to shred landing craft. Thousands of conscripted laborers and prisoners built these defenses under the direction of the German military. In Normandy, concrete bunkers overlooked beaches, camouflaged among dunes and cliffs. Steel hedgehogs, large metal obstacles designed to tear open landing craft, were planted in the tidal zones. Wooden stakes with mines strapped to their tips waited for boats or gliders. Entire fields were sown with mines. For the German command, the goal was simple: to make the coast an unapproachable barrier, a graveyard for any invading army. Yet behind this intimidating facade lay uncertainty. German commanders debated where the Allies would strike. Many believed the logical point was the Pas de Calais, the narrowest point across the English Channel, closest to Britain. Others, like Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, tasked tasked with strengthening the defenses, warned that Normandy was vulnerable and must be fortified more heavily. By spring 1944, the Germans were spread thin, defending hundreds of miles of coastline without knowing where the blow would fall. The resistance and the underground war. The French resistance played a quiet but crucial role in preparing for D-Day. In the countryside, networks of farmers, teachers, and railway workers gathered intelligence on German troop movements. Bridges were secretly mapped, roads studied, and telephone lines cut at opportune moments. The resistance also spread information. Allied radio broadcasts from London, often beginning with the familiar phrase, "Ici Londres, les Français parlent au français," delivered coded messages. Ordinary-sounding sentences, "The daisies are blooming early this year," might signal an upcoming sabotage mission. In Normandy, resistance fighters awaited instructions that would signal the beginning of something larger. They knew that when the Allies landed, their role would be to cut off German reinforcements, sabotage railways, and create confusion. For years, they had worked in the shadows, often at immense personal risk. By June 1944, they sensed the moment of liberation was close, though none knew just how close. The Allies prepare. Across the Channel, Britain had become a giant military camp. Since 1942, plans for an invasion of France had been under discussion, but it was in 1943 that the Allies formally decided to open a second front in Western Europe. The Soviet Union had been urging this move for years, bearing the brunt of the war on the Eastern Front. Now, with American forces pouring into Britain, the Allies had the strength to attempt it. By the spring of 1944, southern England was transformed. Quiet villages and towns filled with American soldiers, roads clogged with jeeps, tanks, and convoys, airfields buzzed with aircraft preparing for airborne operations. Harbors were crowded with landing craft, supply ships, and warships of every size. The sheer scale of the preparation was staggering. Millions of men, thousands of vehicles, endless supplies of ammunition, fuel, and food. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower oversaw this vast enterprise. Calm, steady, and diplomatic, Eisenhower had the task of balancing personalities as much as armies. He had to coordinate British leaders like Winston Churchill and Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, American generals like Omar Bradley and George Patton, and the political expectations of Franklin D. Roosevelt and Charles de Gaulle. The complexity was immense, yet Eisenhower's leadership held it together. Normandy, the land itself. To understand why Normandy was chosen, one must picture the land. Normandy's coastline stretched with sandy beaches broken by rocky cliffs and backed by hedgerows and fields. The hedgerows, centuries-old earthbanks topped with thick shrubs and trees, divided the countryside into a maze of enclosed fields. For an invading army, this terrain could slow movement, conceal defenders, and make every advance costly. The beaches themselves varied. Some, like Omaha, were long, flat expanses overlooked by bluffs, perfect for defenders. Others, like Utah, offered easier access but were separated from the hinterland by marshes and flooding. To the east, near Caen, the terrain was flatter, more open. Beyond the beaches lay towns and villages, Carentan, Bayeux, Caen, names that would soon be etched into history. Normandy was not the obvious choice. Pas-de-Calais was closer, more direct. But Normandy offered other advantages. It was less heavily defended, within range of Allied air cover, and its ports and roads could support the buildup of armies once a beachhead was secured. The choice was both strategic and, in many ways, a gamble. The German Command. In 1944, the German High Command in France was divided. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the overall commander, favored keeping strong reserves inland, ready to counterattack once the Allies revealed their true landing point. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, however, argued differently. He believed the Allies' air and naval superiority meant that once they landed, German forces would never be able to dislodge them. Therefore, Rommel insisted that the beaches must be defended with all available strength, that the invasion must be crushed in the first hours. This disagreement meant that German defenses were never fully unified. Hitler himself, often reluctant to delegate, kept direct control of key armored divisions. On the night of June 5-6, 1944, many of these reserves would remain out of action, awaiting orders that never came in time. The waiting soldiers. For the soldiers themselves, both Allied and German, the world before D-Day was one of waiting. In England, American, British, Canadian, and other Allied troops spent weeks in camps sealed off from civilians preparing for the invasion. They practiced loading and unloading from landing craft, studied sandtable models of the beaches, and wrote letters home. For many, this was their first combat, and though training was intense, the unknown weighed heavily. Would they survive the landing? Would they falter under fire? What awaited them on the other side of the Channel? For German soldiers stationed in Normandy, life seemed routine, even dull. They patrolled beaches, repaired defenses, and watched the sea. Rumors of invasion circulated constantly, but after years of false alarms, many grew weary of the waiting. Some were veterans of the Eastern Front, hardened and skilled. Others were conscripts from occupied countries, or older men reassigned to coastal defense units. Few suspected that within days, the calm of their posts would be shattered by the largest amphibious invasion in history. The sense of anticipation. By late May 1944, a sense of anticipation hung over both sides. The Allies had completed rehearsals for the invasion. Supplies were stacked high in depots. Air forces bombed railways and bridges across France to isolate Normandy. Resistance messages increased in frequency, signaling that something was near. On the German side, commanders noted unusual air activity, increased bombing, and signs of Allied buildup in Britain. Yet their intelligence, confused by Allied deception operations, still pointed toward Pas-de-Calais. In Normandy, life seemed to go on. Farmers tended fields, children played in villages, and German soldiers walked their rounds. The storm was close, but few could see how near. A pause before the storm. To imagine this moment before D-Day is to stand on the edge of history. The beaches of Normandy lay quiet, waves lapping gently against the sand. Villages slept under curfew, windows shuttered, the countryside hushed. In England, soldiers lay awake in their cots, staring into the darkness, thinking of home, of loved ones, of the day to come. The world before the storm was one of fragile stillness. Behind it, years of war and occupation. Ahead, the promise of liberation, but at immense cost. Normandy, a region of farms and fishing villages, of quiet churches and winding hedgerows, would soon be transformed into a battlefield. And as the first days of June passed, the tide of history gathered, ready to break. If the story of D-Day was one of courage on the beaches and in the skies, it was also a story of shadows, illusions, and carefully crafted lies. Before a single landing craft set out for Normandy, before a single paratrooper descended into the hedgerows, the Allies knew that their success depended not only on strength, but on misdirection. They would have to convince the German High Command that the invasion would come elsewhere, at another time and another place. This grand deception, codenamed Operation Bodyguard, was not simply an add-on to the invasion. It was an operation as vast and intricate as the landings themselves. Without it, the Germans might have concentrated their forces in Normandy, overwhelming the invaders before they could establish a foothold. With it, Hitler and his generals would be left uncertain, hesitant, misled at every turn. In many ways, Bodyguard was the invisible shield that guarded the Normandy beaches, woven not from steel or concrete, but from imagination, secrecy, and guile. The need for deception, By early 1944, Allied planners faced an overwhelming problem. The Germans knew an invasion was coming. For years, Hitler had anticipated that Britain would serve as the springboard for an assault on continental Europe. German reconnaissance reported the massive buildup of men and materiel across the Channel. Air raids, troop convoys, and the clatter of industry all pointed toward a coming blow. The only question was where. Germany's defenses stretched across thousands of miles of coastline. To guard them all equally was impossible. If the Germans could be convinced the Allies would land far from the true point of attack, they might concentrate their defenses in the wrong place. Every hour, every day that reinforcements were delayed would give the Allied beachhead a greater chance of survival. Thus, deception became as vital as bullets and bombs. Eisenhower and his planners understood this with crystal clarity. The invasion of Normandy could not succeed without a vast, carefully coordinated effort to mislead the enemy. The principles of Operation Bodyguard. The guiding principles of the deception were laid out in late 1943 and early 1944. The Allies would attempt to create not one but several false impressions. Multiple possible invasion sites. Convince the Germans that a landing could occur in Norway, in southern France, or along the Atlantic coast. The main blow at Pas-de-Calais persuade them that the real decisive invasion would come not at Normandy, but at the Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point between Britain and France. Normandy as a feint. Make the Germans believe that any attack there was merely a diversion, a prelude to the real invasion still to come. Uncertainty of timing. Sow confusion about when the assault would occur, linking it to tides, moonlight, or even diplomatic distractions. The goal was to keep German forces tied down in multiple places, especially at Calais, long after the landings in Normandy had begun. Operation Fortitude, the heart of the deception. At the center of Bodyguard lay Operation Fortitude, which itself was divided into two main branches, Fortitude North and Fortitude South. Fortitude North sought to convince the Germans that the Allies would land in Norway. To support this illusion, radio traffic was generated to suggest an army group stationed in Scotland, preparing for Arctic operations. Dummy camps were laid out, shipping movements staged. Though Norway was not a likely invasion site, it played on German fears of losing vital iron ore supplies from Sweden. Fortitude South, however, was the masterpiece. It aimed to persuade Hitler that the main Allied invasion would strike at the Pas-de-Calais. This was, after all, the most logical place, the shortest crossing from England, the most direct route to Germany, and already heavily fortified. To feed this expectation, the Allies created an entire fictitious army group, the 1st U.S. Army Group, FUSAG, complete with fake headquarters, bogus divisions, and even a commanding general, the flamboyant George S. Patton. Patton was an inspired choice. Revered by his own men and feared by the Germans, he had a reputation as one of the Allies' most aggressive commanders. By assigning him to FUSAG, the Allies lent credibility to the illusion. To German intelligence, it seemed obvious that Patton would lead the decisive invasion. The tools of illusion. The execution of Fortitude involved an astonishing variety of tricks. Across southern England, near Dover, fields were filled with inflatable tanks made of rubber and canvas, which could be inflated and deflated as needed. Aircraft spotters flying over would see what looked like armored divisions massing for action. Wooden mock-ups of trucks, artillery, and landing craft added to the impression. From the air, these deceptions looked convincing. From the ground, they were less so, but the Germans rarely saw them up close. Instead, their reconnaissance aircraft, when they managed to slip past Allied fighters, photographed what seemed to be vast encampments bristling with war machines. To accompany the visual illusions, the Allies created phony radio traffic. Entire networks of operators transmitted constant messages imitating the chatter of large formations, Orders were drafted, reports filed, signals bounced from one station to another. To German codebreakers, it appeared that entire divisions were mobilizing near Dover, preparing to cross the Channel toward Calais. Double agents and the human factor. Perhaps the most brilliant element of Operation Bodyguard lay in its use of double agents. Through painstaking counterintelligence, the Allies had succeeded in turning many of Germany's spies in Britain. Instead of feeding Berlin accurate information, these agents now supplied carefully crafted lies, overseen by British intelligence. One of the most famous was Juan Pujol Garcia, a Spaniard codenamed Garbo. Garbo had built a fictional network of sub-agents, all reporting to him, none of whom existed. Through them, he fed the Germans a steady diet of misleading but plausible reports. He confirmed the existence of FUSAG, described the buildup at Dover, and downplayed activities in the west of England near Normandy. His reports were so convincing that the Germans awarded him the Iron Cross, unaware that he was working entirely for the Allies. Other double agents such as Brutus and Treasure played similar roles. Each provided fragments of a larger picture that, when assembled by German intelligence, painted a convincing but false scenario. The beauty of the deception was its consistency. Aerial reconnaissance, radio traffic, and human reports all aligned, reinforcing the illusion. Weather, tides, and timing. Deception also extended to timing. The Germans knew that certain conditions were necessary for an amphibious landing: a full moon for paratroopers, low tide to expose beach obstacles, calm seas for landing craft. These windows were predictable. The Allies therefore fed information suggesting an invasion date later in the summer, encouraging German commanders to lower their guard in early June. The actual decision to launch on June 6th hinged on weather reports. Storms swept the Channel in early June, making an invasion nearly impossible. But a brief break in the weather, spotted by Allied meteorologists, gave Eisenhower his chance. The Germans, however, had no such forecast. Their meteorologists predicted continued bad weather. Many commanders, Rommel among them, were away from their posts. On the morning of June 6th, Hitler himself was asleep, convinced no attack could come under such conditions. Thus, timing and deception converged. The Germans not only expected the invasion elsewhere, but also believed the weather ruled it out entirely. German reactions to the deception. The effectiveness of Operation Bodyguard became clear in the German response. When the landings began in Normandy, many German commanders still believed they were a diversion. Reports from double agents and intercepted signals suggested that FUSAG under Patton was poised to strike at Calais. Even as the beaches of Normandy turned into a bloody battleground, Hitler withheld key armored divisions waiting for the real invasion at Calais. For weeks, German forces remained tied down in the north, unable to reinforce their comrades fighting desperately in Normandy. This hesitation was critical. Every hour the Germans delayed gave the Allies time to unload more men, more tanks, more supplies onto the beaches. Without it, the fragile foothold in Normandy might have been driven back into the sea. Other elements of Bodyguard. Beyond fortitude, Operation Bodyguard included several other strands of deception. Operation Zeppelin suggested attacks against the Balkans, threatening Greece and southern France. This forced the Germans to keep divisions stationed far from Normandy. Operation Ironside hinted at landings along the Atlantic coast near Bordeaux. Operation Vendetta played on fears of an uprising in French colonies. Each of these threads added to the web, stretching German resources and attention. The brilliance of Bodyguard lay in its layering. No single trick would have sufficed, but together they created a fog of uncertainty that left German command paralyzed. The psychological dimension. Deception worked not only because of Allied skill, but because of German psychology. Hitler himself was deeply convinced that Calais was the likely invasion point. It was closer, more direct, and strategically important. Even as reports came in from Normandy, His fixation on Calais persisted. He clung to the idea that the attack in Normandy was a feint, that the real blow was still to come. This mindset filtered down the chain of command. German officers, fearful of contradicting Hitler, often reinforced his assumptions. Even accurate reports from the field were dismissed or delayed. Thus, Allied deception succeeded not only by presenting false evidence, but by aligning with what the Germans already wanted to believe. The human side of deception. Behind the grand strategies were individuals whose work made deception real. The radio operators who tapped out endless streams of false messages, the engineers who inflated rubber tanks in muddy fields, the intelligence officers who crafted believable cover stories, the resistance members who planted misleading rumors in occupied France. Their contributions rarely involved gunfire or glory. Yet their quiet labors were as decisive as the landing craft that stormed the beaches. The invasion's success depended not only on courage under fire, but on the shadows woven beforehand. The calm before the breakthrough. As June approached, the deception reached its peak. German forces remained fixed on Calais. Reconnaissance flights confirmed the presence of Fusag near Dover. Double agents reassured Berlin that Normandy was not the true target. In the early hours of June 6th, when paratroopers fell and ships advanced, many German commanders still hesitated, convinced that this was merely the opening act of a larger play. In reality, the Great Deception had done its work. The Germans were blinded, their vision narrowed by lies and illusions. The stage was set. The beaches of Normandy lay waiting, quiet in the early dawn, unaware that within hours they would become the center of the world's attention. Reflections on Bodyguard. Looking back, Operation Bodyguard stands as one of the most successful deception campaigns in history. Its brilliance lay in its integration. Aerial, naval, radio, human intelligence, all aligned toward a single goal. It did not guarantee success at Normandy, but it made success possible. Without Bodyguard, the Germans might have concentrated their armor at Normandy from the first hours. They might have overwhelmed the thin line of Allied troops clinging to the beaches. They might have driven them back into the sea. Instead, hesitation and confusion reigned. The Germans waited for an invasion that never came, while the Allies expanded their foothold day by day. By the time Berlin realized the truth, it was too late. A silent victory. The story of deception lacks the thunder of artillery or the heroism of infantry charges. It unfolds quietly in the shadows, with whispers and illusions. Yet it was a victory no less vital than those won with guns. As the men of the Allied armies prepared to cross the Channel, as they wrote last letters and whispered last prayers, another army of shadows had already cleared a path for them. In the silence before the storm, the battle of deception had already been won. And so, when dawn broke over Normandy, the Germans were looking in the wrong direction, waiting for an enemy who would never arrive. The night before the invasion of Normandy was one of suspense and quiet tension, a moment when history seemed to pause on the edge of decision. For years, Allied leaders had planned, argued, prepared, and refined. For months, soldiers had trained in secrecy, rehearsing landings, practicing jumps, and learning the names of villages they had never before heard of. And now, on the eve of June 6, 1944, the greatest armada in history stood ready to sail. But first there was waiting. Always the waiting. The 5th of June was originally chosen as the invasion day. The tides and the moon aligned perfectly. The Allied armies were in position. Yet the weather threatened to unravel everything. Storms swept across the English Channel. High winds churned the sea and low clouds blanketed the skies. Landing craft risked swamping before reaching shore. Airborne troops risked scattering wildly in the dark. Naval bombardments risked falling blind. For Eisenhower and his commanders, the decision was excruciating. They had to weigh the lives of hundreds of thousands of men against the whims of wind and water. In the small hours of June 4th and June 5th, they gathered in conference rooms listening to meteorologists describe storm fronts and pressure systems. At one point, it seemed the invasion might be postponed for weeks, but then a sliver of opportunity appeared. Allied forecasters predicted a brief lull in the weather on June 6th. Not perfect conditions, but just enough. It was a gamble, but the alternative, losing surprise, momentum, and months of preparation, was worse. At last, Eisenhower gave the words that committed history. "Okay, let's go." The soldiers in England. Across southern England, the night of June 5th was unlike any other. In villages and fields that had been turned into vast military camps, hundreds of thousands of men prepared themselves for what lay ahead. Some were veterans of earlier battles, North Africa, Sicily, Italy. Others were new, untested, barely out of training, all carried the same burden, uncertainty. For many, the evening was filled with routine. Equipment was checked and rechecked, weapons cleaned, packs loaded with rations, ammunition, and small keepsakes from home. Identity tags were strung around necks, helmets were adjusted, boots laced tight. Yet beneath the motions lay thought and reflection. Letters were written in quiet corners, last words to parents, wives, sweethearts. Some sealed their envelopes with trembling hands, unsure if the letters would be delivered after victory or after death. Chaplains moved among the troops, offering prayers, hearing confessions, speaking words of comfort. Cigarettes glowed in the darkness as soldiers smoked in silence, their minds far away. Some men laughed loudly, cracking jokes, playing cards, forcing cheer to mask their nerves. Others sat in quiet contemplation, staring into the distance. The air was thick with anticipation, a sense that the next dawn would be unlike any other they had known. The Armada at sea. In ports from Plymouth to Portsmouth, from Dartmouth to Southampton, ships prepared to sail. The scale was almost unimaginable. More than 5,000 vessels, from mighty battleships to tiny landing craft. They crowded harbors, stretched out in long convoys, ready to cross the narrow strip of water that separated Britain from France. For sailors, the evening of June 5th meant final inspections. Boilers were stoked, guns loaded, anchors raised. Crews crowded decks, watching as lines were cast off and vessels slipped slowly into the channel. The sea was restless, waves slapping against hulls, spray blowing over rails. Above, the skies were gray, the clouds low, but the ships pressed forward, guided by escorts and patrols, weaving into the formation that would become the largest invasion fleet in history. From the cliffs and beaches of southern England, civilians watched silently. For months they had seen soldiers and ships gathering, but now the reality of departure sank in. Columns of men marched down lanes toward the shore. Lorries carried supplies. Tanks rumbled onto landing craft. Families stood in doorways, waving, calling out, unsure if they would ever see their neighbors or loved ones again. The Armada stretched across the horizon, lights twinkling faintly in the dusk. It was as though the entire sea itself had turned to iron, bristling with guns, engines, and the determination of nations united in a single cause. Eisenhower and his burden. In the hours before the invasion, Dwight D. Eisenhower carried perhaps the heaviest weight of all. As Supreme Allied Commander, the decision to proceed rested on his shoulders. He knew that if the invasion failed, the consequences would be catastrophic, not only for the men on the beaches, but for the war itself. Failure could mean another year, perhaps many years, of conflict. It could mean shattered alliances, demoralized armies, and emboldened enemies. It could mean Hitler's domination of Europe, prolonged indefinitely. Eisenhower understood this with piercing clarity. Before dawn on June 5th, Eisenhower visited with airborne troops of the 101st Airborne Division. Photographs captured him speaking with young paratroopers, smiling, gesturing with his hands. His demeanor was calm, even cheerful, but inside, he wrestled with doubt. He had even drafted a note to be issued in the event of failure, accepting full responsibility for the defeat. He folded the note into his pocket, carrying it silently as the hours ticked by. For Eisenhower, the night of June 5th was not only a night of decision but of solitude. After months of planning and endless conferences, the moment had arrived when plans left the table and entered reality. And in that moment, all a commander could do was trust. To trust in his men, his colleagues, his preparation, and perhaps in luck. The airborne troops. While the ships prepared to sail, another force readied itself to strike first, the airborne divisions. Thousands of paratroopers of the American 82nd and 101st, along with the British 6th Airborne Division, stood in hangars beside their planes. They wore jump boots, parachutes strapped tight, helmets marked with unit insignias. Faces were blackened with camouflage paint. Rifles, grenades, and ammunition hung from their harnesses. For many, this was their first combat jump. The plan was daring. They would drop behind German lines hours before the seaborne invasion, securing bridges, crossroads, and causeways, disrupting enemy reinforcements. It was a mission fraught with danger. If they scattered, if they landed in the wrong places, they risked isolation, capture, or annihilation. As the evening deepened, engines roared to life. The paratroopers filed into C-47 transport planes, their gear clanking, their hearts pounding. Some tried to joke, others prayed. One man scribbled a note on his helmet, "If found, please send home." The planes lined up on runways, navigation lights glowing faintly in the night. At last, the signal came. One by one, the aircraft thundered into the sky, their wings heavy with men and hope. They formed into long columns stretching into the darkness, heading south across the channel. From the ground, civilians looked up to see endless streams of planes overhead, their drone filling the night air. It was as though the very sky was alive with wings. The German side. On the other side of the channel, in Normandy, the German defenders saw little out of the ordinary. Patrols walked the beaches, officers checked positions, soldiers lounged in bunkers, smoking or playing cards. The weather seemed too rough for an invasion. Some units had been sent inland for exercises. Field Marshal Rommel, convinced that an invasion would not come immediately, had traveled to Germany to visit his wife on her birthday. Other commanders slept, unaware that the storm was gathering above them. For the Germans, June 5th was another night in a long war, a routine watch along the coast of what they called Festung Europa, Fortress Europe. They could not see the armada forming just across the water, nor hear the rumble of aircraft engines filling the skies. They could not know that within hours, the quiet of their posts would be shattered forever. Personal moments of humanity. Amid the vast machinery of war, the evening of June 5th was also a time of small, personal moments. Soldiers tucked photographs of loved ones into breast pockets. Some carried tiny Bibles or good luck charms. One man taped a playing card to his helmet. Another scrawled the name of his hometown on his pack. In barracks and on ships, men shared their fears in whispers. Would the landing succeed? Would they make it through the first hour? Would they ever see home again? Some spoke of farms and families, of sweethearts waiting back in small towns across America, Canada, Britain. Others thought of comrades already lost in earlier battles. For every soldier, the night was both deeply personal and profoundly historical. They were individuals, each with a name and a story, yet together they were part of something far larger than themselves. They were the instruments of liberation, about to set foot on ground that had waited 4 long years for freedom. The weight of silence. As midnight approached, the world seemed to grow still. On the sea, ships moved silently in formation, their lights dimmed, their crews hushed. In the skies, aircraft droned steadily southward. On the ground, soldiers tried to rest, some managing a few hours of sleep, others lying awake, staring at the canvas above their bunks or the steel of the ship's ceiling. The waiting was perhaps the hardest part. Once action began, training and instinct would take over, but in these final hours, there was only thought. Thought of what might come, thought of what might be lost, thought of whether courage would endure when the time arrived. Somewhere in the quiet, the sound of waves against the shore of Normandy went on as it always had, indifferent to the armies gathering beyond the horizon. The beaches, empty and dark, awaited their transformation. The villages lay still, their inhabitants asleep or listening nervously to distant rumors of planes and ships. The storm had not yet broken, but its presence filled the air. The commitment of history. When Eisenhower gave the final order, when the ships began to move and the planes began to fly, the die was cast. There was no turning back. The momentum of history itself seemed to surge forward, carrying with it millions of men and women, entire nations bound together by a single, enormous undertaking. June 5th, 1944, was the last day of waiting, the final breath before the plunge. By the following dawn, the beaches of Normandy would no longer be quiet. They would be filled with smoke, fire, and the cries of men. But in that moment, in the hours before the storm, there was only silence and anticipation. The dawn approaches. As the last hours of June 5th faded into June 6th, the great movement was already underway. Ships plowed steadily through the dark waters, their bows cutting through waves. Aircraft thundered overhead, streams of paratroopers inside waiting for the green light. On the shores of France, the first distant rumble of engines might have been heard faintly, like the growl of an approaching storm. In the villages and towns of Normandy, people stirred in their sleep, unaware that liberation was drawing near. And so the stage was set. The world before the invasion had ended. The world after it had not yet begun. Between the two, there was only this moment, the gathering storm, the quiet breath before history changed forever. When the night of June 5th turned toward the first hours of June 6th, 1944, the invasion of Normandy had already begun. Long before the first landing craft touched the beaches, before naval guns thundered across the horizon, the dark skies over France filled with the hum of engines. Thousands of aircraft crossed the English Channel, bearing men whose mission was to fall silently from the heavens, to land behind enemy lines, and to seize the roads and bridges that would determine the fate of the coming day. This was the airborne assault, one of the most daring undertakings in military history. It was a prelude to the storm, a strike deep into enemy territory carried out under cover of darkness. The paratroopers of the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, along with the British 6th Airborne Division and a smaller contingent of Canadian paratroopers, were the first Allied soldiers to set foot in France on D-Day. Their task was not only dangerous, it was essential. The mission. The airborne plan was ambitious. The beaches, once secured, would be vulnerable to German counterattacks. Roads led inland to Carentan, Sainte-Mère-Église, and Caen. Roads along which German reinforcements could flow quickly to the coast. If armored divisions reached the beaches before the Allies had time to dig in, the invasion might be thrown back into the sea. To prevent this, the paratroopers were to drop behind the German lines in the hours before dawn. The Americans would land on the Cotentin Peninsula, securing causeways across flooded marshes behind Utah Beach and capturing key crossroads. The British and Canadians would drop east of the Orne River, near Caen, to secure bridges and destroy artillery batteries threatening Sword Beach. Their objectives were scattered, their risks immense. Scattered units, heavy fire, flooded fields, and darkness all threatened the mission, yet without their success, the beach landings themselves might never succeed. The flight across the channel. For the paratroopers, the night began in hangars and airfields across southern England. Engines roared as C-47 transport planes lined up along runways. Inside, the men sat on benches weighed down with gear. Each carried not only his parachute but also weapons, ammunition, grenades, and equipment. Some were so heavily burdened they struggled to stand. Faces were painted with black camouflage. Nervous hands checked straps and buckles, fingers tracing the cords of parachutes for the 100th time. Chaplains offered quiet blessings. Officers gave last-minute reminders. The roar of engines outside made conversation difficult. At last, the order came. Men filed up the ramps into the aircraft, their boots clanking on metal, their breath quickening. The planes taxied slowly, engines droning. Then, one by one, they lifted into the night sky. From the ground, civilians in southern England looked upward and saw endless streams of aircraft crossing overhead, their navigation lights glowing faintly. To those on the ground, it seemed as though the very sky was alive, vibrating with the sound of wings. For the men inside, the vibration of engines and the steady rush of air through the fuselage was both a comfort and a reminder. There was no turning back. Crossing the Channel. The flight across the Channel was long and tense. The planes flew in formation, stretching across miles of night sky. The drone of engines was constant, punctuated by occasional bursts of radio chatter. Inside, the men sat in silence, some trying to joke, others lost in thought. The sea below was invisible, a black expanse stretching endlessly beneath them. To the east and west, other columns of planes carried comrades on parallel courses. Occasionally, men peered out of small windows and glimpsed faint shapes in the darkness, the wings of neighboring aircraft, the glow of exhaust flames. As they neared the French coast, the danger increased. German radar picked up the formations. Searchlights probed the skies, beams of white cutting through the dark. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire, their tracers streaking upward in red and orange arcs. The planes jolted as flak exploded around them, shaking men violently in their seats. Some aircraft burst into flames, spiraling downward toward the ground. Others limped forward, smoke trailing behind them. Men inside felt the thud of shrapnel against fuselages, the acrid smell of smoke, the sudden jolt of evasive maneuvers. The night became chaos, flak, fire, evasive dives, shouted commands. The jump. At last, the green light blinked on. Jump masters shouted, "Stand up! Hook up!" Men rose to their feet, clipping parachute static lines to cables. The door opened, and a rush of cold night air swept through the fuselage. Below, the dark landscape of Normandy stretched out, fields, rivers, and villages barely visible in the dim moonlight. One by one, the paratroopers leapt into the night. The slipstream caught them instantly, spinning and jerking. Then, with a sudden jolt, parachutes snapped open, billowing above them. The roar of engines faded as the plane moved on. For a moment, there was only the sound of rushing air and the creak of harness straps. All around, hundreds of parachutes dotted the night sky, pale shapes drifting downward. Some men landed softly in fields or hedgerows. Others crashed into trees, buildings, or flooded marshes. Some landed under fire, bullets tearing through the darkness. Others touched down in eerie silence, the countryside still asleep around them. The landings were chaotic. Many units scattered miles from their intended drop zones. Planes, thrown off course by flak and confusion, released their sticks of paratroopers in the wrong places. Groups that were meant to land together found themselves isolated, small clusters of men wandering through unfamiliar terrain. Scattered, but resolute, the confusion of the drops was both a curse and, in some ways, a blessing. Entire battalions failed to assemble as planned. Communications broke down. Some paratroopers drowned in flooded fields, their heavy gear dragging them under. Others were captured upon landing. Yet scattered groups of men, often no more than a handful, still pressed forward with determination. Small squads blew up bridges, ambushed patrols, or seized crossroads. Isolated platoons created confusion far out of proportion to their numbers, forcing the Germans to fight on multiple fronts. Fires broke out, shots rang through villages, and the countryside was suddenly alive with unexpected combat. In towns like Sainte-Mère-Église, the fighting was fierce. One of the first towns to be liberated on D-Day, it became the site of a famous incident when paratrooper John Steele's parachute caught on the church steeple. Dangling helplessly, he played dead for hours before being cut down. His experience, immortalized in later accounts, became a symbol of both the peril and the persistence of the airborne troops. The British and Canadian landings. To the east, the British 6th Airborne Division faced equally critical tasks. Their objectives included capturing the bridges over the Orne River and the Caen Canal, vital to securing the eastern flank of the landings. Glider troops played a key role, their wooden aircraft silently landing in fields with deadly precision. One of the most famous actions was the capture of Pegasus Bridge, named after the winged horse emblem of the British Airborne. In the early hours of June 6th, gliders crash-landed within yards of the bridge, their noses splintering into the earth. Men tumbled out and, despite shock and injury, stormed the defenses. Within minutes, they had secured the bridge, holding it against counterattacks until reinforcements arrived from the beaches. Elsewhere, British and Canadian paratroopers destroyed artillery batteries, cut communication lines, and blocked German reinforcements. Like their American counterparts, they were scattered, often fighting in small groups, yet their determination held, and their actions prevented German divisions from moving swiftly to the beaches. Courage in the darkness. The night of June 5-6 was one of confusion and chaos, but also of extraordinary courage. Men who landed alone or with only a few comrades pressed on with their missions. A single soldier with a machine gun could hold a crossroads for hours. A small group with explosives could cripple a vital bridge. The airborne troops endured fear, exhaustion, and isolation. They navigated hedgerows and fields in the dark, listening for the clank of German patrols. They fought from behind stone walls and in narrow lanes, firing and retreating, never certain when help would arrive. Some paid the ultimate price. Many never even reached the ground alive, killed in their planes or in the air. Others were captured and marched away into the night. But countless more fought on, improvising, adapting, turning chaos into opportunity. The effect on the Germans. For the German defenders, the sudden appearance of thousands of paratroopers behind their lines was a shock. Confused reports flooded headquarters. Enemy troops in villages, bridges under attack, explosions along roads. At first, commanders struggled to understand the scale of the assault. Was this the main invasion or a diversion? Were these small raids or the vanguard of something larger? The confusion played into Allied hands. German units hesitated, unsure where to concentrate. Reinforcements were delayed, communications disrupted. Instead of rushing to the beaches, many German forces became entangled in firefights with airborne units, losing precious hours. A dawn of fire. As the first light of dawn crept across Normandy, the scattered paratroopers continued their struggle. Smoke rose from burning buildings. The crack of rifles echoed through hedgerows. In some places, church bells rang as villagers awoke to the sight of parachutes tangled in trees, Allied soldiers moving cautiously through their streets. For the people of Normandy, the sight was astonishing. After years of occupation, they saw men descending from the sky, bringing with them the hope of liberation. Some civilians offered water, bread, or guidance. Others hid the wounded, sheltered stragglers or pointed them toward German positions. By sunrise, the airborne operation had succeeded in its most important goal. Despite confusion and losses, the Americans held key causeways leading from Utah Beach. The British secured Pegasus Bridge and the Orne crossings. German reinforcements had been delayed, their movements disrupted. The beaches, only hours away from seeing their own storm, had been given a chance. Reflections on midnight. The airborne assault of D-Day was not neat or orderly. It was chaotic, bloody, and improvisational. Plans unraveled almost as soon as men left their aircraft, units scattered, objectives missed. Yet through courage, determination, and sheer persistence, the paratroopers achieved what mattered most. They sowed confusion among the Germans, blocked reinforcements, and secured the flanks of the invasion. Their sacrifices bought time and space for the soldiers who would soon land on the beaches. In the grand tapestry of D-Day, their threads were woven in darkness, unseen by most, but vital to the pattern. The night sky over Normandy on June 6, 1944, was filled with parachutes, tracer fire, and the roar of engines. It was also filled with the quiet bravery of men who leapt into the unknown, knowing that history itself hung in the balance. The dawn breaks. As the sun rose, the airborne troops were already deep in combat. Bridges were held, villages contested, crossroads blocked. The first waves of landing craft were approaching the shore, carrying tens of thousands more soldiers into the fray. The work of the airborne divisions was far from over. They would continue fighting for days, holding tenuous lines, fending off counterattacks. But by the time dawn touched the beaches, they had already done their part. The invasion, the liberation, and the hope of victory were now possible. The storm had begun. When dawn broke on June 6, 1944, the first thing that met the eyes of German soldiers peering out from their bunkers was not the horizon they had known for years, but an entirely new one. Where once the grey waters of the English Channel stretched empty, now the sea itself seemed alive, transformed into an ocean of steel. Ship after ship, vessel after vessel, filled the waters as far as the eye could see. From mighty battleships and cruisers to humble landing craft and supply barges, the Allied invasion fleet stretched across the Channel in numbers the world had never witnessed before. It was the armada that would deliver liberation to Europe. More than 5,000 ships carried men, tanks, vehicles, ammunition, food, and hope. They came from every corner of the Allied world. American destroyers, British battleships, Canadian frigates, free French cruisers, Polish vessels, Norwegian and Dutch ships, even small craft crewed by men who had fled occupied Europe and now returned as liberators. Together they formed a floating city, a moving continent of iron. The sheer scale of it was overwhelming. For men standing on deck looking out in the dim, early light, it seemed impossible to imagine anything more immense. The armada stretched from horizon to horizon, columns of ships plowing steadily toward the beaches of Normandy. To the soldiers packed into landing craft, the sight was both terrifying and reassuring. Terrifying because the enormity of what lay ahead was now undeniable, reassuring because they were not alone. Tens of thousands moved beside them, all bound for the same shore. The journey across the Channel. The crossing of the Channel was no easy task. The seas were restless, churned by the storms of the previous days. Many soldiers, unused to the constant heaving, were violently seasick. Landing craft, low and open to the waves, pitched and rolled, their decks slick with spray. Men clutched their rifles and helmets, eyes closed against nausea, stomachs twisting. Some vomited into buckets or over the sides, only to have the spray blow back into their faces. For hours, the journey continued. Convoys maintained their formation, guided by escort vessels and naval signals. Minesweepers had cleared paths through German minefields during the night, their crews working with grim determination to open channels wide enough for the fleet. Even so, the threat of mines lingered, and every unexpected jolt of a ship sent hearts pounding. Above, squadrons of Allied aircraft patrolled the skies, guarding against any German interference. Few Luftwaffe planes appeared. The German Air Force, worn thin by years of attrition, could offer only scattered resistance. Yet the risk remained, and gunners stood ready at their posts. For the men packed in the landing craft, the hours of waiting seemed endless. The roar of engines, the slap of waves, the cramped quarters, all wore on their nerves. Some prayed silently, others sang softly, voices trembling. Many simply sat in silence, lost in thought. The naval firepower. As the fleet approached the coast, the great naval guns prepared to speak. Lined up offshore were battleships and cruisers whose main batteries could hurl shells weighing more than a ton, each one capable of pulverizing bunkers, shattering concrete, and blasting apart artillery positions. At dawn, the bombardment began. The still morning air was shattered by thunder. Battleships like HMS Rodney, USS Nevada, and the French battleship Courbet unleashed their guns. Cruisers added their broadsides. Destroyers closed into fire with their smaller, more precise batteries. The sea itself seemed to tremble with the concussions. Onshore, German soldiers were stunned by the fury. Bunkers shook as if caught in earthquakes. Fields erupted in geysers of earth and smoke. Artillery positions vanished under cascades of fire. For miles inland, the bombardment thundered, relentless, overwhelming. The scale of firepower was unlike anything many had ever seen. Entire villages disappeared in clouds of dust. Roads were cratered, bridges shattered. The very landscape seemed to convulse under the weight of shells. For Allied soldiers watching from ships and landing craft, the spectacle was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. The sky lit with flashes, the air shook, the sea echoed with rolling thunder. German experience of the bombardment. For German defenders in their bunkers, the naval bombardment was an ordeal beyond imagining. Some had grown used to occasional air raids, to the distant rumble of artillery. But this was different. This was sustained, concentrated, and crushing. Concrete bunkers shuddered, dust falling from ceilings, lamps swinging wildly. Men covered their ears, huddled in corners, praying for the storm to pass. Some positions were obliterated entirely, their occupants buried under tons of earth and rubble. Others survived only because of the strength of reinforced concrete, but even then, nerves frayed with every impact. Communication lines were severed. Command posts lost contact with frontline units. German artillery batteries targeted by pre-invasion reconnaissance were hammered relentlessly. For many defenders, the hours before the landings were a nightmare of noise, fear, and helplessness. Close support from destroyers. As the landing craft neared the beaches, smaller warships took on a crucial role. Destroyers, sleek and maneuverable, sailed dangerously close to shore, braving mines and coastal guns. Their task was to provide direct fire support, engaging German strongpoints that threatened the landing zones. Many destroyer captains took enormous risks. Some brought their ships so close that they risked grounding in shallow water, all to ensure their guns could fire at precise targets. From their decks, gunners aimed at pillboxes, machine gun nests, and observation posts, blasting them apart with rapid fire. Sailors on these ships later recalled the surreal sight of soldiers struggling ashore while shells from their own guns screamed overhead. The cooperation between sea and land was imperfect, sometimes chaotic, but without the destroyer's support, many more men would have fallen on the beaches. The landing craft. The landing craft themselves were the workhorses of the invasion. Small, ungainly, and often uncomfortable, they carried men and equipment from the great ships offshore to the sand of Normandy. Some were designed for infantry, others for tanks or vehicles. Their ramps clanged open to release their cargo onto hostile shores. On June 6th, thousands of landing craft shuttled back and forth, braving waves, mines, and enemy fire. For the men inside, the experience was claustrophobic and terrifying. Packed shoulder to shoulder, they crouched low as water splashed over the sides. Officers shouted above the roar of engines and surf. Each man knew that the moment the ramp dropped, he would step into a storm of bullets and shells. From the decks of larger ships, observers watched as wave after wave of these small crafts surged toward the beaches. each one a fragile vessel carrying human lives into history. The view from the beaches. From the German perspective on shore, the sight of the Armada was staggering. Soldiers in bunkers peered through narrow slits and saw the horizon filled with ships. The sea itself seemed transformed into an army, moving inexorably closer. The naval bombardments shook the earth around them, but still the ships came. When the landing craft appeared, tiny against the backdrop of the great warships, German defenders braced themselves. Machine gunners checked belts of ammunition, artillery crews adjusted their sights, riflemen peered through periscopes and loopholes. They knew that when the ramps dropped, the true battle would begin. Voices from the sea. Among the sailors of the Armada, the morning of June 6th was a blur of duty, fear, and awe. On battleships, crews worked feverishly to reload massive guns, shells carried up from magazines, charges rammed into breaches, barrels adjusted with precision. On destroyers, sailors shouted commands, targeting bunkers and firing rapidly. On landing craft, coxswains gripped their tillers, guiding their small vessels through surf and obstacles. Each man had his part to play, each a link in the vast chain of invasion. The immensity of the fleet, the thunder of bombardment, the sight of thousands of comrades moving toward the same shore, all created a sense of shared destiny. For many, the noise of the guns was unforgettable. The earth-shaking roar, the flashes of light, the endless concussion. It was a storm of steel unlike anything they had known. The Armada as symbol. The fleet that crossed the Channel on June 6th was not only a military instrument but also a symbol. It represented the combined strength of nations united against tyranny. It carried not only soldiers and guns but also the hopes of occupied Europe. For the people of France, looking out from windows or from hiding places, the sight of Allied ships on the horizon was the first visible sign that liberation had come. For the Germans, it was a vision of doom. The proof that the Allies had returned, that the Atlantic Wall would be tested, that the war had reached its turning point. The first wave approaches. As the bombardment continued, the first waves of landing craft drew near the beaches. Smoke and dust rose inland, obscuring bunkers and strongpoints. The thunder of naval guns rolled on, punctuated by the whine of shells and the crash of explosions. For the men in the small craft, the moment was at hand. They tightened the straps of their helmets, gripped their rifles, checked their gear one last time. Officers shouted orders. Engines roared as the craft drove forward, ramps poised to drop. Behind them, the great fleet still fired, still advanced. Ahead of them, the beaches of Normandy waited. Between the two, the sea boiled with foam, shrapnel, and fear. Reflections on the Armada. The naval armada of D-Day was one of the great logistical achievements of history. It was not merely a collection of ships, but a coordinated instrument of war. Each vessel had its role: to transport, to protect, to bombard, to land. Together they formed a single organism, vast and powerful. The sight of it was unforgettable. For those who were there, whether sailor, soldier, or civilian, the memory of that endless line of ships stretching across the horizon remained seared into their minds forever. It was the moment when the promise of liberation became real, when the long years of preparation and sacrifice finally came together. The thunder of the guns, the roar of the engines, the churn of the waves, all of it signaled the beginning of the end of Nazi domination in Western Europe. The storm is about to break. As dawn brightened into morning, the bombardment continued, though soon it would ease to avoid striking the advancing landing craft. The destroyers fired their last salvos at bunkers. The battleships adjusted their aim farther inland. The landing craft lined up in waves, surging toward the shore. The men on the beaches, the men in the ships, the men in the skies, all now converged on the same point. The great naval armada had brought them this far. Soon the ramps would drop, and the fate of Europe would be decided in blood and fire. The storm had gathered. The storm had thundered across the sea, and now it was about to strike the shore. The armada had crossed the channel. The airborne had fallen through the night sky. The thunder of naval guns still rolled across the morning air. Now came the moment upon which the fate of the invasion depended, the landings themselves. On the coast of Normandy lay 5 beaches, each assigned to a different Allied force, each with its own obstacles, terrain, and challenges. Their names would become immortal: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Together they stretched across 50 miles of coastline. Each beach was different. Marshes and causeways at Utah, cliffs and bluffs at Omaha, open sands at Gold, crowded villages behind Juno, and the flat approaches to Sword. Each would tell its own story of courage, confusion, sacrifice, and survival. Utah Beach. At the far western edge of the invasion lay Utah Beach, assigned to the U.S. 4th Infantry Division under Major General Raymond Barton. Their task was to secure the Cotentin Peninsula and link up with the American airborne divisions already fighting inland. The approach to Utah was not simple. Behind the beach lay flooded marshes, deliberately inundated by the Germans to restrict movement. Only a handful of narrow causeways allowed access inland. Unless those causeways were secured, the beach would be a trap. As the first landing craft drew near, strong currents pushed them off course. Instead of landing where planned, the first wave came ashore nearly 2,000 yards south of their intended sector. In most circumstances, this could have been disastrous. Yet, luck was with them. The defenses in this sector were lighter, and the landing met with relatively little resistance. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., eldest son of former President Theodore Roosevelt, came ashore with the first wave, walking with a cane due to arthritis. Surveying the scene, he calmly declared, "We'll start the war from right here." His leadership steadied the men, and the attack pressed forward. Despite mines and obstacles, the landings at Utah were remarkably successful. By mid-morning, troops had pushed inland, linking with paratroopers and securing causeways. Casualties were relatively light compared to other beaches, fewer than 300 killed, wounded, or missing. Utah had been a gamble, but it paid off. The western flank of the invasion was secure. Omaha Beach. If Utah was the story of luck, Omaha was the story of ordeal. Stretching between Vierville and Colleville-sur-Mer, Omaha was assigned to the U.S. 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions. It was the most heavily defended of all the beaches. The terrain favored the defenders. A long, open stretch of sand rose toward bluffs lined with bunkers, machine guns, and artillery. The Germans, manning positions of the 352nd Infantry Division, had fortified the area with obstacles, mines, and interlocking fields of fire. For the Americans coming ashore, there would be little cover and no easy path forward. As the first landing craft approached, the naval bombardment lifted, but much of it had fallen short or failed to destroy the German defenses. The moment the ramps dropped, machine guns opened fire. Men were cut down before they reached the water. Others drowned, weighed down by heavy packs as they leapt into surf too deep to wade. Those who made it ashore found themselves pinned against seawalls, unable to advance, unable to retreat. Engineers struggled to clear obstacles under relentless fire. Radios failed, units disintegrated. For hours, chaos reigned. Commanders feared Omaha might become a disaster, a slaughterhouse that could jeopardize the entire invasion. And yet, in the face of horror, courage endured. Small groups of men led by junior officers or sometimes by no officers at all crawled forward, scaling cliffs, throwing grenades into bunkers, silencing machine guns. Bit by bit, yard by yard, they gained ground. By afternoon, the first breakthroughs occurred. By evening, the Americans had secured a precarious foothold. The cost was staggering. Over 2,000 casualties in a single day. Omaha was the bloodiest of the beaches, a crucible of fire that tested the very resolve of the invasion. Yet it held. The men of Omaha, through persistence and sacrifice, had carved out a place on the French shore. Gold Beach. To the east of Omaha lay Gold Beach, assigned to the British 50th Infantry Division under Major General Douglas Graham. Their objectives were to secure Bayou, cut the Caen Bayou Road, and link with Canadian forces at Juno. Gold was defended by German infantry supported by artillery batteries, including the formidable battery at Longues-sur-Mer. Strong points dotted the coast, manned by veterans prepared to resist fiercely. The landing began under heavy fire. Tanks designed to swim ashore, DD tanks, struggled in the rough seas, many sinking before reaching the beach. Infantry fought forward through obstacles and mines. The Longues battery, with its 150mm guns, poured fire onto the shore until British forces silenced it with naval bombardment and determined assaults. Despite the resistance, the British pressed inland. Engineers cleared obstacles, artillery support neutralized strongpoints, and by afternoon troops were advancing through villages and hedgerows. Bayou, the first major town to be liberated, fell within a day. Gold Beach showed the effectiveness of coordination. Naval gunfire, specialized tanks, and infantry working together. Casualties were around 1,000, heavy but far fewer than at Omaha. By nightfall, Gold was secure and British forces were moving toward their next objectives. Juno Beach. Between Gold and Sword lay Juno Beach, assigned to the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division. Their task was formidable: land on a narrow front, push inland, and link with both British and American forces. The Canadians faced obstacles as daunting as any on D-Day. Seawalls, mines, and bunkers lined the beach. The village of Courseulles-sur-Mer bristled with defenses. Rough seas delayed the landing craft, exposing the men longer to fire. When the first waves came ashore, they were met with intense resistance. Casualties were high in the opening minutes, among the heaviest of the day. Yet Canadian determination proved unshakable. Once the seawall was breached, the advance pressed inland with speed and ferocity. By evening, Canadian troops had penetrated farther than any other Allied force, reaching within a few miles of Caen. The cost was severe, over 1,000 casualties. But Juno marked a triumph of resilience. The Canadians, long overshadowed by larger allies, proved themselves among the most formidable troops on the field. Their success at Juno became a point of pride, remembered as one of their nation's finest military achievements. Sword Beach. At the easternmost flank lay Sword Beach, assigned to the British 3rd Infantry Division under Major General Tom Rennie. Their goal was ambitious: to capture Caen, the vital crossroads city. Sword's defenses were lighter than at Omaha, but still dangerous. German strongpoints lined the coast and armored reinforcements loomed nearby. The landing began under artillery and machine gun fire. Men fought through beach obstacles, cleared minefields, and pushed into villages. By midday, British forces had linked with paratroopers of the 6th Airborne Division, securing the vital bridges over the Orne River and ensuring the eastern flank of the invasion. Yet progress toward Caen slowed. German panzer divisions, including the feared 21st Panzer, counterattacked fiercely. By evening, British troops had secured the beach and advanced several miles inland, but Caen remained beyond reach. The battle for the city would continue for weeks, becoming one of the longest struggles of the Normandy campaign. Sword Beach, however, had done its job. It anchored the eastern flank, linked with airborne troops, and stood firm against counterattacks. Casualties numbered around 700, a heavy price, but one that secured the line. 5 beaches, 1 invasion. By the close of June 6th, all 5 beaches were in Allied hands. The bridgeheads were fragile, the footholds narrow, and the cost in lives enormous. Yet the invasion had succeeded. The Atlantic Wall had been breached. At Utah, luck and leadership had carried the day. At Omaha, blood and sacrifice had carved out a foothold. At Gold, steady progress had secured vital ground. At Juno, Canadian courage had carried the line farther than any. At Sword, determination had held the flank and linked with airborne comrades. Together, the 5 beaches formed a single front, a 50-mile line of liberation. Behind them, the Armada continued to pour men and supplies onto the shore. Ahead of them lay the hedgerows, the villages, the fields, and the long road to Paris. The human cost. The price of the landings was staggering. On June 6th alone, Allied forces suffered more than 10,000 casualties, killed, wounded, or missing. German losses were also heavy, though exact numbers remain uncertain. Civilians too bore the burden, with villages shattered, homes destroyed, and families caught in the crossfire. Yet within that cost lay the seed of victory. The foothold gained on D-Day could not be undone. The beaches, secured with blood, would become the gateway to the liberation of France and the defeat of Nazi Germany. Reflections on the beaches. Each beach tells its own story, but together they tell a greater one. The story of D-Day is not only one of strategy and firepower, but also of human courage. Men faced machine guns, artillery, mines, and obstacles, yet still pressed forward. They came from farms and cities, from across oceans, from nations bound together by a single purpose. The beaches of Normandy today are quiet, their sands washed by tides, their bluffs covered in grass and flowers. Visitors walk where men once fell, hearing only the wind and the sea. But beneath that silence lies memory, the memory of June 6, 1944, when 5 beaches became the turning point of a world at war. Among the 5 beaches of D-Day, none has entered history with such resonance, such weight of memory, as Omaha Beach. It was here, on the gently sloping sands between Vierzich-sur-Mer and Colleville-sur-Mer, that the invasion faced its sternest test. For the Americans who came ashore, Omaha became a crucible, a place of chaos, blood, and heroism, where the outcome of the entire operation hung in the balance. To walk its sands today is to encounter quiet beauty, rolling surf, wide sands, cliffs rising steeply beyond. But on June 6, 1944, this stretch of coast was transformed into something else entirely, a killing ground, where survival seemed doubtful and courage was demanded beyond measure. The terrain. Omaha's geography made it formidable. The beach was about 6 miles long, framed by rocky headlands at each end. Behind the sands rose bluffs, steep and commanding, up to 150 feet high. These bluffs were cut with gullies, natural draws leading inland, that the Germans fortified as funnels of fire. Atop the bluffs they built bunkers, trenches, and strongpoints, all interlocking, all designed to sweep the beach with enfilading fire. The tidal flats themselves were treacherous. At low tide, wide stretches of sand lay exposed, leaving attackers vulnerable for hundreds of yards. The Germans had filled these flats with obstacles, wooden stakes tipped with mines, steel hedgehogs designed to rip apart landing craft, rows of barbed wire, and mines buried in the sand. From the perspective of a defender, Omaha was ideal ground. From the perspective of an attacker, it was a nightmare. The defenders. Defending Omaha was the German 352nd Infantry Division, a veteran formation bolstered by young recruits but commanded by officers who had fought on the Eastern Front. Unlike some of the weaker coastal divisions, the 352nd was experienced, disciplined, and well-equipped. Its soldiers occupied reinforced bunkers of thick concrete, camouflaged gun emplacements, and trenches dug into the bluffs. Machine guns covered every approach. Mortars and artillery were positioned to fire onto the sand. When the first American soldiers came into view, the German defenders were ready. They had endured the naval bombardment, sheltered in bunkers that withstood the pounding. Now, as the landing craft approached, they prepared to unleash their fire. The first wave. At 6:30 a.m., the ramps dropped on the first wave of landing craft. Out poured men of the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, and the 29th Infantry Division, made up largely of National Guard units from Virginia and Maryland. They stepped into water waist deep, sometimes neck deep, burdened with packs, rifles, and equipment. Many drowned before reaching shore. Others staggered forward, only to be met with machine gun fire that swept across the surf like a scythe. Survivors scrambled for cover behind steel obstacles or low ridges of sand. But cover was scarce, and the fire was relentless. Officers were cut down in moments. Radios failed, drowned in seawater. Entire platoons vanished in minutes. Confusion reigned. The beach, intended to be secured quickly, became a place of paralysis. Men huddled under fire, unable to advance, unable to retreat. The tide crept upward, threatening to drown the wounded who could not move. Engineers and obstacles. Combat engineers tasked with clearing obstacles faced almost impossible odds. Laden with explosives, they waded ashore under fire, desperately trying to blow gaps through mines and steel. Many fell before they could even begin their work. Of the 16 engineer teams that landed in the first wave, only a handful managed to clear partial lanes. Still, fragments of their work endured. Blown obstacles created narrow channels through which later waves of troops and tanks could attempt to move. Their sacrifice laid the groundwork for survival, even as their losses mounted. The human experience. For the men on Omaha, the experience was one of terror beyond words. They remember the hiss of bullets striking water around them, the thud of shells exploding in sand, the screams of the wounded carried on the wind. Some lay flat, pressing themselves into the beach as if trying to vanish. Others ran forward in desperate bursts, diving into craters for shelter. Medics worked frantically, dragging men to cover, bandaging wounds under fire, setting up aid stations behind seawalls. Corpses floated in the surf or lay scattered across the sand, their equipment still strapped on. The water itself turned red in places. And yet, in the midst of this horror, small acts of courage emerged. Men pulled comrades from the surf, charged bunkers alone, fired rifles until barrels glowed hot. Officers who survived rallied their men, shouting above the din, urging them to keep moving. The turning point. For hours, Omaha hung in the balance. Reports filtered back to headquarters that the landing was faltering. Eisenhower himself feared the worst. Could Omaha be abandoned? Would the Americans be forced to withdraw? If so, the invasion line would be fatally weakened, perhaps fatally compromised. The turning came not through grand maneuvers, but through the persistence of small groups. Scattered squads, sometimes no more than a dozen men, began to inch forward up the gullies. Using grenades, rifles, and sheer determination, they assaulted machine gun nests, silencing one position at a time. At Vieilleville, at Colville, at Les Moulins, men climbed the bluffs, crawling through brush, firing upward at bunkers. Naval destroyers, seeing the crisis, closed in dangerously near shore, firing directly into German positions at point-blank range. The combined pressure began to crack the defenses. By early afternoon, the first breakthroughs were made. Small units reached the top of the bluffs, outflanking bunkers and seizing high ground. Once footholds were established above the beach, the defense began to crumble. The afternoon advance. As the day wore on, more troops came ashore, pushing inland through the gaps. Engineers cleared additional lanes, tanks began to arrive, and artillery was set up on the sand to fire inland. The Germans, under pressure and running short of ammunition, began to fall back. By evening, the Americans had secured several exits from the beach and linked scattered footholds into a fragile line. The beachhead was thin, losses were immense, but Omaha had not been lost. The impossible had been endured. Casualties and sacrifice. The cost was staggering. Of the 34,000 men who landed on Omaha on June 6th, over 2,000 became casualties, killed, wounded, or missing. Entire companies were wiped out in minutes. At some points, casualty rates exceeded 50%. And yet, for all the blood and loss, the foothold had been gained. The sacrifices of those hours ensured that the Allies could link Utah in the west with gold in the east, forming a continuous front. Omaha's agony secured the center of the invasion line. Voices from Omaha. Veterans of Omaha remembered it with searing clarity. One described the beach as hell with the lid off. Another recalled the silence after landing craft ramps dropped. Silence broken instantly by the chatter of machine guns. Medics remembered dragging men through surf under fire, shielding them with their own bodies. Engineers remembered crawling through minefields with explosives strapped to their backs. These voices speak not of grand strategy but of survival, courage, and loss. They remind us that Omaha was not only a military operation, but a human ordeal lived moment by moment. The symbol of Omaha. In the years since, Omaha has come to symbolize the struggle of D-Day itself. It embodies the price of liberation, the resilience of ordinary soldiers, the thin line between disaster and triumph. Where Utah was swift and gold was steady, Omaha was desperate, a place where success was carved out against all odds. The beach became a testament to persistence, not because plans unfolded smoothly, but because men refused to break, even when everything seemed lost. It was a victory not of perfection, but of endurance. The beach today. Today, Omaha is quiet. The wide sands are empty, but for visitors who walk slowly, pausing to reflect. The bluffs are covered in grass and trees. The sea rolls in with gentle waves, indifferent to the history it witnessed. Above the beach lies the Normandy American Cemetery, where rows upon rows of white crosses and stars of David mark the graves of those who fell. The symmetry of the markers, the hush of the wind, the sweep of the sea, all combine to create a place of solemn remembrance. Standing there, one can imagine the chaos of June 6th, but also the silence that followed. The silence of men who had endured the crucible, who had turned the tide, who had carried the burden of freedom onto foreign shores. Omaha Beach was the costliest of the D-Day landings, the place where victory was most uncertain. Yet it also became the most defining. It revealed the harsh reality of war, where plans falter, where chaos reigns, where courage is the only constant. In the broader story of Normandy, Omaha was the trial by fire. Its success was not inevitable. It was won by determination, by sacrifice, by the refusal to give in even when the sea itself seemed hostile and the cliffs impassable. To fall asleep thinking of Omaha is not to dwell on horror, but to reflect on resilience, on how men, ordinary in peace, extraordinary in war, faced the impossible and overcame it. The quiet of Omaha today is the greatest testament to their struggle. Where once the beach rang with gunfire and cries, now it hears only waves and wind. The storm is past. By the evening of June 6, 1944, the beaches of Normandy were no longer silent stretches of sand. They had been transformed into footholds of liberation, tenuous but real. The Allies had come ashore at immense cost, and now faced the next challenge, to break out from the beaches and carve a line inland. The story of D-Day is often told as the storming of the beaches, yet the true measure of the invasion's success was not only in landing, but in holding, linking, and pushing forward. It was in the hedgerows and villages, in the muddy fields and narrow lanes where the first fragile threads of the invasion wove themselves into a fabric strong enough to resist German counterattacks. The landscape of Normandy. To understand what came after the landings, one must imagine the countryside of Normandy. This was not open terrain where armies could maneuver freely. Instead, it was a patchwork of fields bordered by hedgerows. thick earthen banks topped with dense shrubs and trees some centuries old. These hedgerows created natural walls, enclosing fields like a labyrinth. For defenders, they were perfect cover. For attackers, they were obstacles that turned every advance into a struggle. A soldier moving from one field to the next had to climb over the bank, exposing himself to fire, while defenders waited unseen on the far side. In many ways, the hedgerows of Normandy were as formidable as any bunker or trench. Utah, linking with the airborne. At Utah Beach, the landings had gone relatively smoothly, and by late morning, troops of the 4th Infantry Division were linking with paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions. These airborne troops had spent the night scattered across the Cotentin Peninsula, fighting in isolated groups, blowing bridges, and seizing crossroads. Now, as the infantry pushed inland from the beach, the scattered paratroopers emerged from villages, farmhouses, and hedgerows, linking with the new arrivals. Together, they secured causeways across the flooded marshes, ensuring that reinforcements and supplies could flow inland. The link-up was a moment of relief and triumph. For the paratroopers, who had fought alone for hours, the sight of infantry columns was reassurance that they were not abandoned. For the beach troops, meeting the airborne meant their line was expanding, their hold firming. Omaha, from chaos to foothold. At Omaha Beach, the day had begun in near disaster, but by afternoon small groups had clawed their way up the bluffs, silencing German strongpoints. By evening, the Americans had carved out several exits inland, linking scattered positions into a narrow but secure front. The inland advance, however, was slow. Units were disorganized, casualties heavy, and German resistance still fierce. Yet the crucial fact was this: Omaha had not been lost. The Americans held the bluffs, and reinforcements continued to pour ashore. The bridgehead, though thin, was real. Gold. The British push inland. At Gold Beach, British forces had secured their landing zones by mid-afternoon and were advancing inland. Tanks and infantry moved through villages, clearing German strongpoints and establishing roadblocks. By nightfall, they had reached the outskirts of Bayeux, a medieval town that would become the first major French town liberated after D-Day. The capture of Bayeux the following day was a symbolic victory. It fell largely intact, spared the destruction that had devastated many other towns. Its liberation demonstrated that the Allies were moving beyond the beaches into the heart of Normandy. Juno. The Canadian advance. At Juno Beach, the Canadians endured heavy fire in the morning but advanced farther inland than any other force by nightfall. They reached within a few miles of Caen, the critical crossroads city. Villages fell to their advance, and German defenders, though stubborn, were driven back. The Canadian advance was marked by determination and efficiency, but also by high casualties. More than 1,000 Canadian soldiers were killed or wounded on D-Day, yet their progress inland was undeniable. They had carved out a wedge that would prove vital in linking the eastern beaches. Sword. Holding the eastern flank. At Sword Beach, British troops pushed inland toward Caen, linking with paratroopers of the 6th Airborne Division, who had secured bridges across the Orne River. This link-up ensured the eastern flank of the invasion was protected from German counterattacks across the river. Yet Sword also faced the first armored counterattack of D-Day. In the afternoon, the 21st Panzer Division launched an assault, sending tanks toward the beaches. For a moment, it seemed the Germans might drive a wedge between the British and Canadian forces. But Allied air power and naval guns intervened, halting the attack. The beaches held. The German response. For the Germans, the hours after the landings were ones of confusion and missed opportunities. Reports flooded in from multiple beaches, paratrooper attacks, and villages aflame. German commanders struggled to understand the scale of the invasion. Was Normandy the main blow, or was this still a feint, with the real invasion coming at Pas de Calais? Hitler himself, convinced of deception, delayed releasing armored reserves. Some panzer divisions remained idle, awaiting orders that never came in time. Others moved slowly, hindered by Allied air attacks that bombed roads, bridges, and convoys. What could have been swift counterattacks turned into hesitant, piecemeal responses. Still, where German units fought, they fought fiercely. Villages became strongpoints, hedgerows became fortresses, and every field was contested. The Allies had gained the beaches, but they had not yet broken free of the grip of Normandy's terrain or its defenders. The role of civilians. Amid the fighting, civilians of Normandy lived through a day of terror and hope. Villagers awoke to the thunder of naval guns, the roar of aircraft, and the sight of parachutes drifting across the sky. Many hid in cellars as shells and bombs shattered their homes. Others emerged cautiously, offering water, bread, or directions to Allied soldiers. For some, liberation came swiftly. In towns like Sainte-Mère-Église, the arrival of American paratroopers meant freedom after 4 years of occupation. For others, the price was destruction, as artillery and bombing reduced homes to rubble. The civilians of Normandy endured suffering and loss, but also witnessed the first steps of their liberation. Their fields, hedgerows, and villages became the battleground upon which the fate of Europe was decided. The Allied beachhead. By nightfall on June 6th, the Allies had secured a continuous line across Normandy's coast. Utah and Omaha were linked in the west. Gold, Juno, and Sword were linked in the east. The total force ashore numbered over 150,000 men, along with tanks, artillery, and supplies. The beachheads varied in depth. At Utah, the Americans pushed several miles inland. At Omaha, the front was shallow and precarious. At Juno, Canadians reached farther than any. But the essential fact was that all 5 beaches had held. The Atlantic Wall had been breached. The night of June 6th. As darkness fell, the beaches quieted. Fires smoldered in villages. Wounded were evacuated to ships offshore. Engineers worked through the night, clearing obstacles, building temporary roads, and unloading supplies from ships. Naval guns remained vigilant, ready to fire at any sign of counterattack. Onshore, soldiers dug foxholes, posted sentries, and tried to rest after a day of chaos. The dead lay where they had fallen, some buried hastily in shallow graves, others still on the sand. The sea lapped quietly at the shore, indifferent to the cost of the day. For the men who survived, exhaustion overwhelmed fear. They slept in hedgerows, in ditches, in captured bunkers, clutching rifles even in slumber. Tomorrow would bring more fighting. But for now, they had endured the first day. The meaning of breakthrough. The breakthrough of D-Day was not a sweeping advance. It was not the dramatic dash across open fields or the swift liberation of cities. Instead, it was the slow, grueling process of transforming fragile beachheads into a front. It was about securing causeways, capturing villages, linking scattered units, and holding against counterattacks. The achievement of June 6th lay in endurance. The Allies had not been thrown back into the sea. They had clung to the beaches, expanded their footholds, and set the stage for the campaign to come. The storm of steel and fire had not broken them. The breaking through of Normandy on June 6th was fragile, costly, and uncertain. Yet it succeeded. The footholds established on that day became the launching point for the liberation of France and the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany. It was a victory measured not in sweeping maneuvers, but in inches gained and held. It was won not only by generals and plans, but by ordinary soldiers who pressed forward through fear and chaos. The night of June 6th closed on a changed world. The Allies were back in France. Europe's liberation had begun. The beaches of Normandy, once quiet, now bore the imprint of history, a line in the sand that marked the beginning of the end of the war in Europe. When the sun set on June 6, 1944, Normandy was a changed land. The beaches, once quiet, were scarred with craters, obstacles, and the remnants of battle. Villages smoldered, fields were torn apart, and the sea itself carried wreckage ashore. The longest day had passed, but its echoes lingered through the night and into the days that followed. The invasion had succeeded. The Allies were ashore, their foothold secure, but the cost was immense, and the struggle was far from over. D-Day was only the beginning of a campaign that would stretch across weeks of bitter fighting. For the soldiers who survived June 6th, the days immediately afterward were filled with exhaustion, reflection, and the grim realization that liberation would not come easily. The human cost. The casualty lists from D-Day were staggering. Allied forces suffered over 10,000 casualties, killed, wounded, or missing. Among them were over 4,000 dead. Omaha Beach alone accounted for more than 2,000 casualties, while Utah, Gold, Juno, and Sword added their own tolls. Airborne divisions lost thousands more in their scattered, chaotic drops. German casualties are harder to measure, but estimates suggest 4,000 to 9,000 killed, wounded, or captured. Many units were shattered, their positions overrun, their survivors retreating inland or surrendering. Civilians too paid a heavy price. Normandy's towns and villages lay in ruins. Bombing, shelling, and fire destroyed homes, farms, and churches. Families huddled in cellars, emerging to find their communities transformed into battlefields. For them, liberation came with loss, a reminder that freedom was never free. The scene at the beaches. On the morning of June 7th, the beaches of Normandy were scenes of organized chaos. Wreckage littered the sand, destroyed landing craft, burned out tanks, broken equipment, and the bodies of men who had fallen in the assault. Engineers worked tirelessly to clear obstacles, bulldozers pushing wreckage aside, cranes lifting damaged vehicles. The sea was alive with activity. Ships continued to arrive, unloading supplies, vehicles, and reinforcements. LSTs, landing ship tanks, dropped their ramps, releasing trucks and tanks onto the sand. DUKWs, amphibious trucks, carried loads from ship to shore. The flow was relentless, essential to sustaining the invasion. Medical stations treated the wounded in tents and on ships offshore. Medics worked day and night, amputating limbs, dressing wounds, offering morphine to ease pain. Hospital ships ferried the worst cases back across the channel. For many survivors, the battle would remain with them for the rest of their lives. The airborne divisions. Inland, the airborne troops continued their fight. Scattered across the countryside, they gathered into larger units, consolidating their positions. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions secured towns like Sainte-Mère-Église, holding crossroads and repelling counterattacks. Their link-up with forces from Utah Beach created a solid western flank. On the eastern flank, the British 6th Airborne Division held Pegasus Bridge and the Orne crossings against repeated assaults. Their defense prevented German armor from driving into the beachhead, buying critical time for reinforcements to arrive. For the airborne soldiers, the days after D-Day were ones of exhaustion and constant combat. They fought from hedgerow to hedgerow, holding ground against larger forces. Their scattered landings had created chaos, but their stubborn resistance had turned that chaos into advantage. The German situation. For the Germans, the aftermath of D-Day was one of confusion and frustration. Reports from the front were fragmented. Commanders argued over whether Normandy was the main invasion or merely a diversion. Hitler, convinced that Pas-de-Calais remained the true target, withheld reserves that might have turned the tide. German units in Normandy fought with determination, but they were isolated and under constant attack from Allied aircraft. Convoys moving by day were bombed and strafed. Bridges and railroads were destroyed by the resistance and Allied bombers. Reinforcements struggled to reach the battlefield. Still, Where German units held, they held fiercely. Villages became fortresses, hedgerows became lines of defense, and counterattacks tested the Allies at every turn. The war in Normandy was only beginning, and the Germans would not give up easily. Life for the soldiers. For the Allied soldiers, the days after D-Day were a blur of exhaustion and danger. Sleep came in snatches, meals were hurried, and combat was constant. Foxholes were dug into hedgerows, providing meager shelter from artillery and snipers. Mud and dust clung to uniforms. The dead lay unburied in fields, a grim reminder of the cost already paid. Yet amid the hardship, there were moments of relief. Soldiers met comrades they had feared lost. Supplies of food, ammunition, and cigarettes reached the front. French civilians offered wine, cider, or bread when they could. Liberation was not only military, it was also human, felt in the smiles of villagers who dared to hope again. The role of civilians. For the people of Normandy, the days after D-Day were both joyous and tragic. They welcomed the Allies as liberators, but they also faced devastation. Towns like Caen, Saint-Lô, and Carentan suffered heavy bombing and shelling. Homes were destroyed, families displaced, fields ruined. Civilians took shelter where they could, often in cellars or barns. Some aided the Allies, guiding troops through the countryside, pointing out German positions, or providing food. Others searched for loved ones amid the ruins, mourning losses even as they celebrated freedom. The liberation of Normandy was a shared struggle. Soldiers and civilians alike endured its cost. Consolidating the beachheads. The most urgent task after D-Day was to connect and expand the beachheads. Engineers built roads, laid pipelines, and constructed temporary harbors, known as mulberry harbors, to handle the flow of supplies. These artificial harbors, assembled from prefabricated sections towed across the channel, became vital lifelines, allowing the Allies to unload thousands of tons of cargo each day. By June 12th, the beaches had linked into a continuous front. Utah and Omaha joined with the British at Gold. Gold connected with Juno and Sword. The Allies now held a solid 50-mile line along the Normandy coast. This line was fragile, shallow in depth, and constantly tested by German counterattacks, but it was unbroken. The Allies were in France to stay. The battle for the bocage. As the Allies pushed inland, they encountered the bocage, the hedgerow country of Normandy. These ancient earth banks and thick hedges divided the land into small fields, creating natural fortresses. Tanks struggled to break through. Infantry faced ambushes at every turn. Progress slowed to a crawl. Every field became a battle. Soldiers fought yard by yard, climbing over banks, throwing grenades into hedgerows and advancing under fire. The bocage turned Normandy into a grinding struggle where victory was measured in feet gained, not miles. For the men who had survived the beaches, the hedgerows became a new ordeal. The longest day was over, but the longest weeks were only beginning. The symbol of liberation. Despite the hardship, the significance of D-Day was clear. The Allies had returned to France. After 4 years of occupation, the people of Normandy saw foreign troops not as conquerors but as liberators. The tricolour flag of France was raised in villages, church bells rang. Children greeted soldiers with smiles and cheers. The landings were a promise made real, that Europe would be freed, that tyranny would be broken, that sacrifice had meaning. For the soldiers who fought and the civilians who endured, this promise gave strength to face the days ahead. Reflections on the aftermath. The aftermath of D-Day was a paradox of triumph and tragedy. It was triumph in that the invasion had succeeded, the beachheads held, and the campaign for France begun. It was tragedy in the scale of destruction, the lives lost, the villages reduced to rubble. The men who survived June 6th carried the memory with them forever. They remembered the fear of the landing craft, the chaos of the beaches, the comrades who fell beside them. For them, the war would never be abstract. It would always be personal, measured in the faces of those who did not return. For the world, D-Day marked the turning of the tide. It was the beginning of the end of the Second World War in Europe. But for those in Normandy in the days that followed, it was simply survival, holding ground, enduring hardship, and pressing forward into a future that was not yet secure. The long road ahead. D-Day was not the end of the war. It was not even the end of the battle for Normandy. Ahead lay weeks of brutal fighting, the struggle for Caen, the battles of the Bocage, the German counterattacks at Mortain, the breakout at Saint-Lô, and the encirclement at Falaise. Each would demand more sacrifice, more endurance, more resolve. But none of it would have been possible without June 6th. The longest day had opened the door. Now, through that door, the armies of liberation would march. The quiet of evening. As June 6th gave way to June 7th, the beaches settled into a strange quiet. The roar of battle subsided into distant artillery, the crash of waves, the murmur of voices. Soldiers dug in, civilians emerged cautiously. Ships continued their endless shuttle across the channel. The quiet was deceptive. The war was far from over, but for those who had survived, it was a chance to breathe, to rest, to remember. They had lived through the storm. They had seen the impossible become reality. They had endured the longest day. When the guns fell silent on the night of June 6, 1944, Normandy was scarred but liberated, bruised but alive with new hope. The beaches that had been scenes of chaos and slaughter only hours earlier now served as the threshold of freedom. Soldiers huddled in foxholes, engineers worked tirelessly to clear wreckage, medics tended to the wounded, and civilians stepped cautiously out of cellars to greet a new dawn. The longest day was over, but its meaning had only just begun to unfold. D-Day was not simply a battle. It was a moment when history itself shifted, when the tide of war turned irreversibly, when courage and sacrifice combined to open the road to victory. Its legacy would extend far beyond the shores of Normandy, shaping the destiny of nations and the memory of generations. The road to Paris. In the weeks after D-Day, the Allies fought their way through the hedgerows of Normandy. Progress was slow, measured in yards rather than miles. German resistance was fierce, exploiting every hedge, every village, every hill. The battles for Caen, Carentan, and Saint-Lô became grueling struggles of attrition. Yet the foothold held, and gradually it expanded. With reinforcements pouring in through the artificial mulberry harbors, the Allies built up their strength. By July, the front lines stretched deep into Normandy. In August, a breakout at Saint-Lô and the encirclement at Falaise shattered German forces. The road to Paris opened. On August 25, 1944, Paris was liberated. Crowds filled the streets, cheering, singing, waving flags. The dream that had begun on the beaches of Normandy became reality. France was free again. The liberation of Europe. D-Day was the beginning of the end of Nazi occupation in Western Europe. After France came Belgium, the Netherlands, and eventually Germany itself. Each step was hard fought, each victory purchased with sacrifice, but the momentum was unstoppable. The landings gave the Allies a Western front that joined with the Soviet advance from the east. Together they pressed Germany on two sides, squeezing its armies, denying it resources, and forcing it into retreat. Less than a year after D-Day, in May 1945, the war in Europe ended with Germany's unconditional surrender. Without the success of D-Day, this outcome would have been delayed, perhaps denied altogether. Normandy was not the final chapter of the war, but it was the turning point that made the final chapter possible. The cost of victory. The legacy of D-Day is measured not only in liberation, but also in loss. More than 4,000 Allied soldiers were killed on June 6th alone. Thousands more were wounded or missing. German casualties were heavy as well, their defenders fighting with determination even as their positions collapsed. The cemeteries of Normandy bear witness to this cost. At Colville-sur-Mer, above Omaha Beach, rows of white crosses and stars of David stretch endlessly across green lawns, overlooking the sand where so many fell. At La Combe, German graves lie beneath dark crosses, a reminder that even the defenders, many of them young conscripts, were caught in the storm of war. Canadian, British, and Polish cemeteries mark their own silent fields of sacrifice. Each grave is a story unfinished, a life cut short, a reminder that freedom has a price. Walking among them, one feels both the weight of grief and the solemn gratitude of survival. The civilians of Normandy. The people of Normandy too carry the legacy. Their villages were battlefields, their homes destroyed, their families torn apart. Yet they also witnessed liberation, embraced their liberators, and began the long process of rebuilding. Stories abound of villagers offering cider and bread to soldiers, of children waving flags, of church bells ringing after years of silence. Liberation was joy tempered by sorrow, for many families mourned loved ones lost to bombs and shells, but the gratitude endured. To this day, the people of Normandy welcome visitors from allied nations, remembering the sacrifices that brought their freedom. Remembrance. In the decades since, D-Day has been remembered with reverence across the world. Veterans return to Normandy to walk the beaches where they once fought, to touch the sand where friends fell, to see the land they helped liberate. Ceremonies marked anniversaries, with presidents, prime ministers, and monarchs standing side by side with ordinary soldiers. Museums and memorials preserve the memory. The Pegasus Bridge Museum tells the story of the airborne assault. The Juno Beach Center honors Canada's role. Pointe du Hoc stands as a monument to the rangers who scaled its cliffs. The cemeteries, with their endless rows, speak more eloquently than words. For younger generations, D-Day became both history and symbol. It represents not only military triumph, but also the unity of nations, the courage of ordinary men, and the determination to resist tyranny. The symbol of unity. One of the enduring legacies of D-Day is the unity it represented. The invasion was not the work of one nation alone, but of many. Americans, British, Canadians, Free French, Poles, Norwegians, Australians, New Zealanders, and others all took part. Each brought their own strengths, each contributed to the whole. This cooperation was unprecedented. Never before had such an armada, such a coalition come together for a single operation. It foreshadowed the alliances that would shape the post-war world, from NATO to the European Union. In many ways, the unity of D-Day planted the seeds of the unity that would define Europe's future. The lessons of D-Day. What lessons does D-Day offer? It teaches the value of preparation, the meticulous planning, the rehearsals, the logistics that made the invasion possible. It teaches the necessity of deception, the brilliance of Operation Bodyguard, which convinced the Germans to look elsewhere. It teaches the power of persistence, that even when plans unraveled, when chaos reigned at Omaha, when losses mounted, determination could still carve victory from disaster. Above all, it teaches the cost of freedom. D-Day reminds us that liberty is not given freely, but earned and defended through sacrifice. It is a lesson that echoes across generations, urging each to remember, to honor, and to preserve what was so dearly won. The beaches today. Today, the beaches of Normandy are places of quiet reflection. Children play in the sand where soldiers once bled. Waves lap gently at the shore, where landing craft once crashed. The cliffs and bluffs are green with grass, no longer bristling with guns. Yet reminders remain. Concrete bunkers stand, weathered but intact, silent sentinels of the past. Rusted obstacles are half buried in the sand. Plaques and markers tell stories of units, individuals, and moments of courage. Visitors walk slowly, reading names, imagining the chaos that once consumed these quiet shores. The peace of Normandy today is itself a legacy of D-Day. The silence, the beauty, the freedom of the land are tributes to those who fought and fell. The eternal longest day. For those who were there, June 6th never truly ended. Veterans carried its memories all their lives. Some spoke of it often, recounting stories to children and grandchildren. Others remained silent, unable to put into words what they had seen. For all, it was a day that shaped them forever. Historians call it the longest day, and rightly so. From the midnight drops of the airborne to the last firefights at dusk, it was a day that seemed endless, filled with terror, courage, and uncertainty. But in another sense, the longest day never ended. Its legacy continues, carried forward by memory, by gratitude, by the freedom it secured. The storm and the silence. The story of D-Day is a story of contrasts. It is the story of storm and silence, of chaos and calm, of destruction and liberation. It began with darkness, with men falling through night skies, with ships crossing stormy seas, with hearts heavy with fear. It unfolded with thunder, with naval guns, with machine guns, with cries and explosions. It ended with silence, foxholes dug, villages smoldering, the sea washing gently over the sand once more. That silence is the true legacy, for it was silence bought at immense cost, silence that meant no more occupation, no more tyranny, no more fear. It was the silence of liberation, of peace reclaimed. To fall asleep to the story of D-Day is to honor both storm and silence. It is to remember the men who stormed the beaches, the civilians who endured the occupation, the sailors who crossed the sea, the pilots who filled the skies. It is to reflect on the unity of nations, the courage of individuals, and the meaning of sacrifice. Normandy's longest day was also the world's turning day. From its beaches stretched the path to Paris, to Berlin, to freedom. Its legacy lives not only in history books or memorials, but in the quiet of a free Europe, in the laughter of children on beaches once scarred by war, in the enduring memory of those who gave their lives so that others might live free. The storm has passed, the silence remains, and in that silence we remember.